So welcome everybody to Education Fast Forward 12. Education Fast Forward is a charity registered here in the United Kingdom, and its aim is to actually generate debates between all stakeholders in education globally. We've been running for 4 years, we've had 11 debates to date, and we've succeeded in reaching through broadcasting our debates live, as we are now, this is live, on an IPTV feed, and having people tweet about the debate and getting feedback about those tweets. So last time we actually reached 2.1 million different people during the debate. So no pressure on us to do well today. The feedback from the debate is something that we want to improve on. And today, Education Fast Forward is able to announce that we will have a fund. So if teachers in your country want to follow up on something, they should contact Education Fast Forward and we'll see if we can help them financially to do something as a result of the debate. We haven't got a lot of money, but we have got some money. Today, we are honoured to have two very important people in the world of understanding the link between education impact and economic development. Andreas Schleicher is Director for Education Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General of the OECD. He's a key member of the OECD senior management team, and he does a lot of work, as you know, and it's not just PISA, by the way, at trying to understand from data what makes a difference. Before joining OECD, Andreas was Director for Analysis for the International Association of Education Achievement. Andreas is very well placed to be able to open our debate today. Andreas.
Thanks very much. Good morning to all of you. If there's one lesson that we have learned through the recent years of the economic crisis, is that you cannot simply bail yourself out of an economic crisis. You cannot solely stimulate yourself out of a crisis, and you can't just print money your way out of a crisis. Your best bet is simply to give more people better skills, to collaborate, compete and connect, and that's actually something where we have a lot of work to do. Today we are launching new data that show levels of education attained, and what you see here are the most privileged countries, the industrialized one. And you can see, 1 in 6 young people have not even reached the baseline level of education. Those people lack elementary qualifications. And this is, the red bar is sort of the threshold, which is just the entrance ticket to the knowledge economy. It's a lot of work for us to do. When you look at who is actually lacking, it's largely young men. They get better chances in employment, but when you look at levels of education, actually they lag significantly behind. You look at Portugal, Spain, Brazil, and then you can say, well, maybe in those countries you didn't expect that much, but next on the list are countries like Denmark and Latvia. So this is a pretty robust problem in many countries. Other countries sort of have at least got the genders right. The UK, this country here, is actually doing quite well in gender equity in education. But then you look at this the other way around, actually. Who is not participating in the economy? These are the so-called NEETs, people who are not in education, not in employment. And again, you see that almost 1 in 5 20 to 24-year-olds are in this category. And again, you find countries, the UK is an example now. Lots of people go to school, but then you can see not all of that translates into economic activity. Lots of work for all of us to do. Why is it so important to get this right? Because the link between educational attainment and skills and economic outcomes is getting tighter and tighter every day. People at the high end of the skills distribution never had the life chances they enjoy today. Now, despite all the economic crisis, people at the high end of the skill distribution have really been fine. People at the bottom end have paid most of the price for the economic crisis. Look at these data. Private returns. Now, you get a tertiary qualification, a university degree or an advanced vocational education, and people complain about tuition fees and all of those kind of things. But actually, the returns to individuals after subtracting all of the investment is huge. You talk about hundreds of thousands of US dollars. What about taxpayers? And this is where the interesting story begins, actually. You can see societies actually benefit. Governments make a lot more profit out of better educated people than what they actually invest. because people with better skills pay more taxes and therefore society benefits. And this is just the monetary side of it. You could look at the social side as well. It's about social participation, about trust in our societies, about the link between education and health that actually you can add to this. Huge reasons for this. This is sort of qualifications. I want to take an angle also about, what drives success today is the 21st century skills that make so much of a difference. Problem-solving skills in a digital environment. I don't have data for so many countries, but for some, we have actually quite good assessment data. These are adults who have basic problem-solving skills, and there's a smaller group that have advanced digital problem-solving skills. And one of the things that you actually see is that we're only talking about 1/3 of the adult population that is fit for this kind of digital society that we all talk about, this flat world where everybody can participate, collaborate, compete, and connect. No? 1/3 of adults. And now you'll tell me, wow, this is all about older people not keeping up with technology and things like this. But actually, you look at the young generation, you can see it does look better, but still, we're only talking about half of the people, even in the most advanced economies. You look at Korea here, it's really interesting. Now, the older generation falling behind, or at least less developed, the young generation actually getting it, very well equipped. But you look at just one level above, the United States, and you can see actually young people entering the labor market are not much better skilled than those leaving for retirement. A lot of things for us to do to equip more people with better skills. But, and actually, just one point, why is it so important? You look at employment. Everybody talks about employment today. If you have medium to low problem-solving skills, actually you're worse and worse and worse off. Because those kinds of routine cognitive skills are easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource, so that's where the job losses are. You're actually much better off if you have very low levels of skills than if you have medium levels of skills, because those jobs are quite stable. Our economies actually provide lots of jobs where you don't need great skills. They pay you less and less. That's the problem, but you can keep a job. But actually, the only growth that we are seeing is at the high level of the skill distribution. This is the dilemma in which we are. Just getting people to sort of a so-so skill level is not going to help us. We need to get lots of more people to lots of better levels of qualifications. But actually, just before the session, I was talking with a school head from Zimbabwe, and he was telling me actually, we have actually great literacy rates, but our economy is in shambles. How can that be? And the answer is on this slide. Economic success is not about the skills you have, but about the skills you use. You can actually see that use of reading skills at work is a very powerful predictor for labor productivity. And actually, this is where the other side of the coin is. We talk about education, equipping people with skills, but we also need to do better in extracting value from those skills in our economies. And you can all have people talk about it. We have lots of graduates on our streets who cannot find a job, look for employment. And at the very same time, employers tell you, we cannot find the people with the skills we need. This is the dilemma. And I show you two examples. Number one in the world in terms of equipping people with skills, Japan. A country that is enormously successful in educating people. But when you actually look at how Japan uses their skills, how Japanese actually get to deploy their skills, you can see they're good in reading, writing, numeracy, social, ICT actually very bad, and problem solving virtually non-existing. The economy is not very good in turning better skills into better jobs and better lives. You look at the United Kingdom, it's actually the reverse. The United Kingdom is just so in equipping people with skills, but the economy is very good in converting skills into jobs and lives. Both sides of the equation are important. When we talk about education, we tend to only talk about one side of the equation, equipping people with skills. We need to pay a lot more attention to the other side. How do we actually convert better skills into better jobs and better lives? And there are good answers to this. We know pretty much about the mechanisms that exist behind this. Let me talk about what we can learn from this for policy. The first is getting people up to speed, high-quality initial education. And that's about early childhood education, it's about schools, tertiary education. It's about financial support for the disadvantaged. How can we attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? Get the best principals into the toughest schools. It's about, not just schools. It's about making learning everybody's business. This is not about public or private. This is about public with private. It's about governments, employers, workers, parents working together. It's also about figuring out that people with low skills are not going to do this on themselves. Making learning everybody's business absolutely key to success. Providing more effective links between learning and work. Now, we know that work-based learning is a big part of the key to success and the link between education and employment. Countries with strong apprenticeship systems have come really well through the crisis because employment provides a fantastic way for people to develop real skills on real equipment, also the kind of social skills that are so critical for success today. Employer engagement. How do you get employers on board of this? Very, very important part of success in turning schooling into better success. Bringing education to the lives of people, allowing workers to adapt learning to their lives. Sounds so trivial, but when you actually enter a university, they will tell you, well, you have to come here in the morning to follow our course. And if you want to study part-time, longer term, it's actually very, very difficult. The Nordic countries in Europe are doing very well on this. They are beginning to make lifelong learning a reality for all. You can actually decide where you learn, how you learn, when you learn. But this is just a handful of countries. In most of our countries, we have still a pretty rigid institutional framework for learning that is not equipped to upgrade people's skills. It's about improving transparency. Who tells young people the truth about what the value, the labor market value of degrees and qualifications is? How do you find out, actually, what you're going to get out of a university degree? Nobody does this. Our information systems are very, very poor in this respect. What we need is easily searchable, up-to-date online information about, what are the skills that our societies need and what are the skills that people actually have. Very, very important to develop better information systems about this. Guidance. We talk about career guidance when people move into the workplace. Well, why don't we do this in primary education? When do people actually shape their kind of aspirations for their own careers? People in primary school all love science. It's one of the most interesting school subjects for primary students. At the secondary level of education, everybody hates it. Something is going fundamentally wrong because people do not see what science is, how science opens life opportunities. They see in a very abstract school subject that is not related to their lives. Providing really good guidance, very, very important key. And the last point I want to make is actually help employers make better use of worker skills. This is about more flexible work arrangements that accommodate workers who have sort of different needs. It's about keeping older workers in the labor markets. It's about encouraging employers to hire those who may have temporarily withdrawn from the labor market. There's a lot of potential in our economy. It's very highly skilled people who do not get the opportunities they deserve. Women, people with disadvantages, lots of people actually we can draw into the economy and strengthen the links between skills and education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I can only apologise for this side of the hall because Andreas' slides aren't there and we've been doing psychic things but we can't make it work yet. Andreas, will your slides be available afterwards? Okay, so we'll put them on EFF12.org where you can download the slides afterwards. But we do have a technical problem, so I apologise. But it's not a problem now because Stefan's not going to use slides. Stefan, I've looked at your CV and I think I'd take the whole debate reading out the range of things that you do. It's very, very impressive. But Stefan Dercon is Chief Economist at the Department for International Development in London. He's also Professor of Development Economics at the University of Oxford. And he advises the Department for International Development on strategy and research, especially around economic aspects of development. What I particularly like is that Stefan also focuses on microeconomics, the stuff that makes a difference right on the ground. The hashtag again is EFF12. Please use it. Andreas, do we have a problem with tweeting some of the information? Because isn't there an embargo on some of the things? That's okay, is it? Because Andreas was talking about things which actually are going to be announced today, so you're being very privileged with some of that information. Stefan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Well, it's a hard act to follow to speak after Andreas. And what I would like to do is to make 4 points. And they are essentially trying to take some of the thinking that Andreas is presenting, but actually trying to bring this in the context of rather poor countries. Low-income countries, maybe lower middle-income countries, and actually trying to see what are the kind of issues that emerge there, and are we getting the right thinking, the right focus on the importance of education. Now, what Andreas has shown very clearly is this, this undoubtedly close association between what we do in education and in skill formation and success in economies. Okay? And I do think that, I probably would have all of you on my side if I basically based my talk on saying education is the most important thing we can do in development and we should do an awful lot about it. I'm not going to do this. So I'm going to turn it actually a little bit more subtly. And actually I want to be a little bit more precise where and how we should think about some of the challenges of education and skill formation in the economies of developing countries, and what does it mean in the way we work in some of these places. And so the first point I want to make is that at our peril, we are too naive about what education can do in some of these very low and poor countries. We cannot simply assume that as long as we keep on spending more on education, these economies will grow, jobs will be created, opportunities will be created, and all will be well. There's still, even people in my profession as development economists would say, oh, this is no-brainer, that's the only thing we need to do. We have to be very careful. Association is not the same as causation. I will definitely agree that without good and effective education systems, you can't sustain or fuel growth. There is a real role to be played there. But it's not enough in itself to create the jobs of the future, even the job of the present, as we know very well. In fact, Andreas is referring to it already. There's a huge amount of, there's many, many countries where we're actually observing a lot of kids coming onto the labor market, leaving school, with some skills or with at least some education. But they don't find jobs. High level of unemployment, even across the world, high levels of underemployment. People are not quite used effectively, be able to use effectively the skills they've acquired. And we have to be very careful. There's a lot of people that say, oh, the only problem here is we just don't teach them the right things. If we only had them the right things, it will be fine. Or if we teach them the right thing, this economy will immediately expand to all these jobs and they will be absorbed. Actually, it's not the case. It actually is really important that in a lot of developing countries, the structure of growth and the structure of these economies are really not ready to start absorbing a lot of these people. And I think Andreas referred to it, there are two sides of the coin here, which is, the demand for labor, the way labor markets absorb the labor and the way structures of economies develop, the nature of economic development and growth process in developing countries are important. There's no amount of vocational training or better skills training that will solve it. It is not, labor markets is not simply facing in developing countries or in general a problem of mismatch. There is just a mismatch between what employers want and what schools teach. Even though there is some mismatch, in every country we'll find us. I was in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, only 10 days ago it's now. There I heard that, these days some of the mines, the Gécamine mine, was actually getting workers from Kinshasa. Okay, they argued also from China, but let's not go into that. But at least they were getting them from Kinshasa and not from Katanga itself, because the employers were complaining about it. Now, yes, there is a mismatch, and there's skills that can be acquired, vocational training that can be done. But we're still talking in many of these countries are very small numbers. The number of formal sector jobs, the number of jobs for educated people is just very small. So we should not simply say that education and skill formation is going to be the problem for this fundamental mismatch and the nature of this growth process. But once we have growth processes that are trying to absorb labor, of course, It's so crucial to make sure that people are used to their full productivity, that labor productivity is high, and that we actually can offer people returns to all this skill acquisition they get. And sustaining and fueling growth, that's where education will have a big role. But it's not enough simply to say it will solve all the problems. It's the first point. Don't be too naive about the link between boosting education and growth, especially in low-income economies, will take place. I keep on saying lower-income economies there because we do know that the link between education and growth in higher-end economies, in pushing the frontiers, economies that already have reached their frontier and pushing it out, it's actually very important. So in industrialized economies, economies that are transforming into knowledge economies, of course, education starts playing a different role. But we should be very careful in some of the poorest settings. Now, it may sound negative because it means you can't simply say, we do education because it's so good for growth, and therefore let's keep on focusing on that. No. For me, and also from where I'm sitting in my organization in DFID, but also intellectually when I think about it, you know, where you have the massive wealth of evidence in poor countries, is that there is no stronger force for inclusion than education. There is no stronger force across the world to actually fight inequalities than education. And so we dare very much, if we're interested, which we are, in progress that the poor can make, and if we're interested in avoiding extreme inequalities that actually are damaging for economies, then actually education is a really powerful mechanism. This is not just in general, it's of course definitely true for women, as a real important ways of making progress. It's actually quite interesting because in political terms, it tends to also avoid some of the real pitfalls of political economy that we have on issues to do, for example, with wealth redistribution or even just benefit systems and so on, where a lot of people, especially middle class and richer classes or political classes that control economies, don't consider the poor very deserving. Actually, what's beautiful about education is a lot of wealth redistribution by stealth. You don't really need to take anything away from richer, but you actually get poorer people to build up their skills and their knowledge, so actually they can start competing with some of these wealthier people also in the labor market. They're really powerful forces, and they're very cunning forces as well. And there's another part where I think education has a real important role. It's in resilience against shocks and disasters. We get quite a lot of evidence that people with good education have more opportunities and can actually be more flexible and actually find better ways to coping with a lot of adversity and change. In fact, I don't know the data, but I'm pretty sure, definitely as a hypothesis I would put forward, that if we start looking at a profile of who got affected by Ebola, for example, in Sierra Leone, I bet you'll find a strong correlation with not being educated, even controlling for wealth differences. These factors are really important also to deal with important disasters. So there's really a very strong role in development for education. Don't overstate necessarily the simplistic view that it's all about that's how the economies will grow. But there's such a powerful force of change in societies. And in the long run, it's essential to keep on fueling and sustaining growth and keeping some balance, both in economies and indeed in societies. But my third point is that we could do substantially better in what we do. I work in an organization where at times, especially for the outside world, and I can assure you it is not internally like this, but at the outside world it seems like, oh well, it's a world where, as long as you spend some money on it, you'll solve the problem. It's the money of the world of budgets, of education budgets in developing countries and so on. Well, actually, we had to learn some harsh lesson. Because if we look at how the indicators of quality of education have been progressing in recent times, we've been managing to get the quantity increased quite substantially, but we're not really doing very well in quality. And in fact, we've kept the inequalities in quality of education similar. The outcomes are again another source of inequality that's emerging, and actually poorer people don't get necessarily a good deal. So we don't deliver necessarily very well. So we need to pay much more attention to getting the systems going, making them more effective. And this is by benchmarking. It's something I find really powerful in low-income countries or low-middle-income countries when they start benchmarking against international standards, because it gives you a snapshot. Maybe it looks like a beauty contest, but it does wake up political leaders to actually see what's going on. It has a real powerful role to play. And another one would be to actually get challenges in education systems. One of the most exciting areas of research in education has been things that we've learned, say, in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, that actually low-cost private schooling could deliver similar qualities or even better qualities for the same amounts of money as actually state systems could do. There is a lot of slack in the systems that we've allowed to develop, and it's really important, not simply saying, let's build up private schooling. I don't think that's the big lesson here. But simply, if we find benchmark cases that people can do much better with smaller amounts of money to get the same level of quality of education, as we've seen in India and Pakistan in some settings, then it's a real interesting challenge, and a challenge that education systems should take to try to improve. And then to finish, we should be conscious that even though it is so important to get education right, and education systems are hard to develop and to improve, we should be conscious that decision-making is really difficult. This is an area, compared to many other areas, where we can get it easily wrong if we don't think very carefully, because we don't see the result next year. The results really tend to be measured in societies, in their inequalities, in their poverty reduction, in their economies in terms of sustaining and fuel growth quite in the long term. We need to think very, very carefully, and we need to be conscious that these are difficult things to do. It does mean that intellectually, I feel like we need to think a bit harder, use evidence much better, and really learn a bit more. It's not just getting budgets of education up, it's getting to use them much better in many places. That will be very important for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I think I'm meant to sit down, but I can't help but stand up. It feels like the right thing to do. I think I'm getting really confused, actually, because I don't understand what the word quality means anymore as things change. And maybe some anachronistic views of what quality was from education systems based on knowledge-based economies, where people were paid for knowing stuff. And Andreas, I think you said often that we're not going to be paid for knowing stuff, only about applying stuff in the future. But the whole point of Education Fast Forward is to hear what teachers have got to say, because it's all well and good as policymakers talking like this, but what's it like from the floor? What are people saying are the important issues? Now, in the audience today, we've got Sharath Jivan, who is CEO and founder of STIR Education, working with teachers on the ground in both India and Uganda. So, have you got a comment to make after our input from our two guest speakers?
Yeah, definitely. So, great to hear from. Very inspiring to
You don't have to hold that, by the way. Just
exactly. I was going to say that as well. So we pulled. So we work with several thousand teachers across India and Uganda, and we asked them for their views of what they would do in terms of giving advice to ministers in this kind of forum. And one of the things that really struck us actually was, I think in India, 60% of teachers felt that the prospect of economic success motivates children, and there's a strong motivator there. In Uganda, that was as high as 90%. So I think that link between economic success, that motivational piece, came out as very, very strongly among the teacher base. But what was interesting, almost linking a bit to what Andreas was saying earlier, they realized that the motivation was different from reality. So only a much smaller percentage of teachers felt that this would actually lead to better success because of some of the things that perhaps Stefan has also said, like labour market outcomes. So I think in a nutshell what they were calling for, and this was across 9 states in India, about 8 districts in Uganda, was just a rethink of how we think about college and school education. So for example, vocational training came up as one very strong one area there. No huge surprise, but I think particularly looking at self-employment, I think so much of education systems now, from what our teachers are saying, is geared towards traditional employment. We know the reality for most that will be around setting up their own business, their own running their own rickshaw, or whatever it might be in an Indian and Ugandan context. And then the other thing that was really interesting was just around much better career counselling. We talk to many kids in low-income areas, and we ask them, what would you like to be when you grow up? And the first thing they'll say is, I want to be a teacher. That's the only professional role model they've had. So how can we have a much richer ecosystem of advice, a bit like the chart Andreas was showing, but perhaps not online, much more easy to disseminate to teachers themselves? And I think a final point was really about practical application-driven teaching as well. They'd love to be part of it. We're building a big movement of teachers around the developing world at STEM who want to improve learning. But how can we give teachers tools so that they can help their children really think in much more practical ways, acquire those 21st century skills, which are going to be even more important for developing economies. So hopefully that was a short, snappy summary of what some of our teachers were saying. Thank you.
I'm quite impressed by how quickly you can get that data. It's very good. Yeah, very good, thank you. Lord Jim Knight, the former Minister of Education in the UK, who's in the front row. Guys? He's on a fitness regime. Jim.
Thank you, Jim. I was also an employment minister in the last government too, so I have the perspective of the two in thinking about the labour market as well as education. And I'm most interested in ensuring we define this debate about economic success as about an inclusive economy. That I think, if Oxfam are right today that 1% of the world's population are going to earn more than the rest of us, and maybe I'm in the 1%, so I use the term us loosely. But if that's true, then we should be talking to the people who are at Davos right now, as well as talking to ourselves here, because we see in this country the rise of extremist politics. We see that across the Western world, and I think that's because most people are seeing globalization and technological change leaving them behind. They live in industrial centers where the economy doesn't work for those centers anymore, and they don't see the hope for their children that they want to see. And so politicians need to manage the economy in a much more inclusive way, and in doing so, they then need to take education more seriously. And I think that's at the heart of that debate. And before we talk about anything else, I'd just love us to be really clear that it's an inclusive vision that we're after.
Thanks, Jim. I wonder if we can go across to the people in Norway, in Oslo, who I hope have been listening in. Can we switch to Norway, guys? Are we there? Excellent.
We're here.
So Lars in Norway, obviously your economy is booming for various reasons, and I did read that in 2008 you guys tried to spend your way out of youth unemployment. Can you comment on that?
With some care, I'll try. Youth unemployment has been rather low in Norway compared to many other countries. But still, what we see is a big dropout rate from upper secondary on level with most other European and OECD countries. So the answer is there's no guarantee that you can spend yourself out of some unemployment for youth. It's all about how you make them interested and motivated to both take education and work, which is a totally different standard than paying for it to happen.
Anybody else in Oslo like to comment?
Yeah, Øystein Johannessen here. I'd also like to comment on a couple of issues. I think that still in an economy like the Norwegian economy that has survived recent economic crisis quite well, the job number one is still to improve the attainment, especially in upper secondary education, as Lars mentioned, because we do need, through that and other measures, to increase the pool of talent in Norway, because we will survive not on our oil and gas resources, that is the big deal in the economy and has been so for the last couple of decades, but we have to survive on our talent. I would also like to just follow up on what Professor Dercon said on the difficulty of the challenges of decision making in and for education. I think that's a good point. You may say, and I don't think that's very provocative, that decision-making in education is too important to be left to education alone. I think that it's interesting listening to what Lord Jim Knight said, combining the perspectives of both education and employment. So some key decisions on education should be collective decisions with decision makers from education, employment, and other fields of government and society. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if we can go to Sao Paulo, where we have Eduardo Chavez. He's got up very early in the morning to be part of our discussion. Have you got anything to add?
Yes, Jim, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. Please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to start with a brief comment. I think we're viewing education from the top down. We're looking at the fact that we have in developed countries a digital economy, for instance, that requires specific competencies and skills to operate nicely. And then we say, in which way can education help people develop those competencies and skills that are required and necessary for a digital economy? This is a top-down approach. OECD countries, developed countries, specifically from an economic point of view, decide what is important for this kind of economy and therefore what education should be doing. And I think we should look, and this is, I think, a perspective that is very germane to countries in development. We should look at the thing from the bottom up. We should ask people what they want to do in life, what their life project is. Perhaps they don't want to work for a multinational company. Perhaps they don't want to work for a globalized, non-governmental organization. Perhaps they have other passions, other interests. So we should start with the individual and what the interests and passions of that individual is, and then try to define what sort of competencies and skills are necessary to promote those passions, those interests. If you come talking about digital economy to most people who are out of school in Brazil, or if you speak of economic development for Latin American countries, or if you speak about economic success for them, this doesn't get their attention. But if we speak about what they want in life, what their passions are, and what talents are necessary to promote those passions, you may get their interest. So I think we're looking at a thing from the top down instead of from the bottom up. And this is a way of viewing things that will not really communicate well with people in countries in development.
Eduardo, I think that leads us very nicely into the third part of the triangle, from policymakers, teachers, to youth voice. In the audience we have Russ Quaglia. Russ, would you like to comment on Eduardo's points there, that we need to drive this from both directions, not just from one?
Sure, thank you. That is very intimidating. Yeah, but thank you. I love Andreas' point where he talked about it doesn't matter about the skills, but it's how you use those skills. And what's interesting in our research, when we talk to the students, they want to use those skills. They think learning can be fun. They think it can be interesting. They think it can be engaging. And over 90% of the students say they want to learn more. Yet when we ask them what's happening in schools, we ask them, does this engage you in your learning? Are you challenged? There are around 40% that agree with that statement. So I'm always stuck between what policymakers are suggesting for these students aren't totally related to where these students want to go. I like the notion, too, about providing better guidance. I'm not sure they actually know where they want to go yet, but I know they want to go somewhere different than we're leading them right now. Hence the importance of the top-down and bottom-up.
Absolutely.
So
both,
thank you.
Both. Andreas, Stefan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I want to take up Jim's point. I think that the issue of inclusiveness is the issue of our times. Now, our economies are sort of growing people more and more apart. Some will become very rich and we're all dead in some time. I think this is sort of the kind of issue that we need to deal with. Why is this so difficult? Because it's squarely a skills issue. You can map economic inequalities today almost one-to-one to inequalities in the skills and capacities of people. In the past, it was easy to deal with inclusion. You just take money from the rich through taxes, give it to the poor, redistribution. Today, that no longer works because the source of those inequalities are the capacities of people, the capacities to have the right skills, to deploy the right skills. And one thing I think we have to face up to that our education system actually often makes things worse. They tend to reinforce, not moderate, social inequalities. We give the best educational opportunities to those who are coming from the most privileged backgrounds, who are not getting the most talented teachers in the challenging classrooms. This is one of the things that I think are really, really an issue. But the link between the inequality in skills and inequality in our economic outcomes and social outcomes is becoming a lot stronger these days. The second point I want to make, and I think Stefan has made this as well, is that we need to get the demand and supply issues in balance. We need to develop the right skills, make sure that people deploy the right skills. It's a sort of chicken and egg issue now. And this is an area where I think, can learn a lot from East Asia. Chinese parents and grandparents are going to invest their last resources in the education of their children, their future. In the Western world, we tend to spend the money of our children for our consumption today. It's almost the reverse. Investing in the future, and you can ask yourself, they are silly. They build all this education as human capital, and their economy isn't ready for it. Well, we used to say this about the Japanese as well. In the 1940s and 50s, the Japanese were starting to put college graduates into car factories. And my country, Germany, #1 in car production, said, how these silly Japanese, they waste all their talent in building cars. Well, 20 years later, it was those people who revolutionized the car industry and made Japan #1 in the development of cars. And so in a sense, you could have said, let's wait until our economy is ready and then we develop the talent. No, they did the opposite. They had the right people, the right skills, and those people created their jobs. Now, today, you do not educate for a job. You educate people to create their job, to develop the next economy. And I think this is really, really crucial. We need to get demand and supply sides in balance, but it's a chicken and egg issue. Where do you really start with this?
Stefan?
Right. So let me just add that 2 points. The first thing, I think the comments in terms of what teachers were thinking, and the comment that was made also on, referring again back to some of this mismatch. The children are being educated, they have huge aspirations, they have huge expectations, but actually it's not quite fulfilled. And there are things and the challenges that I see in some of the type of countries that you refer to, like in India or in Uganda, where we do need to think of economies of education systems that deliver both for the long run and the short run there as well. In the long run, there is a vision, and maybe there is still a vague hope that the East Asian type of situation may well start arising. But on the other hand, these children fairly quickly, and always those of us with children notice very much more quickly than we sometimes expect. Suddenly they are on the labor market and they are having expectations and aspirations to do it. So there is something about, you refer to self-employment and maybe vocational education. I tend to think in general it's about skills that are transferable, that are can be more broadly used in economies. And there is some more creative thinking to be done. Poor, lazy policymakers, of which I seem to have joined the ranks these days, you start very quickly say, oh, that's vocational training. No, look, there's a huge array in it. There is actually loads of countries where vocational training has never really functioned. It's extremely hard to get some of these things going. Don't simply think that's the solution. It does need local context, almost very specific type of solutions. But very specifically also, simply saying let's prepare them all for self-employment, I would be a bit cautious on that. Actually, that's what poor people do at the moment. That's what they want to escape. Some of them may well become the new Bill Gateses, but don't start saying we do all these things because everybody will be successful. The percentage of people that are successful as poor people from self-employment, it's really, really small. We do need economies, and that brings us to the jobs kind of thing. Maybe we can't emulate in Africa, for example, the East Asian miracle kind of things. But we do at the moment have a growth process that's not creating jobs. It's largely driven by natural resource wealth. It's not labor intensive. Very few of these economies or governments are trying to get some incentives going to actually make this a bit more labor intensive. We need to do this. And maybe it's also something teachers should do and people in education systems. Talk to the pupils about it, make them aware, make them also thinking about what's happening in their countries, because I think there's something political about this as well. This is not just about skills, it's also about having the skills to engage in political processes, in openness, and maybe make schools havens of openness and governance, good governance. That would be really good in many of the countries I work in, as the islands, to actually show the example to the rest of these economies.
I've got a question of my own, actually, if I'm allowed to abuse my position. I'm not. What percentage of the world's working population, does anybody know, works for companies of, say, 20 or less, or 10,000 or more? And the reason why I ask the question is, I think a lot of people follow the mantras that come out of the large multinational corporates as what is needed from education systems, and perhaps that's not the message for the majority of working people. I used to teach mathematics, and I worked with British Telecom on the skills deficit between the students I was producing and what they needed. And when we asked 1,000 engineers what mathematics they used every day, it was almost nothing. And I just find that a really interesting challenge. So do you know what that proportion is?
I can only tell you for the OECD countries, but I think on a worldwide scale what you can say is the vast majority, and it's actually the only part of the economy that's growing currently.
Right.
The vast majority is in what? Small.
In small.
Yes. So I would, so on the growing part, I would be a bit more cautious. When we go to developing countries, a firm in many of the low-income countries in Africa that I work in, 20 was already a pretty big firm. What we unfortunately do know is that labor productivity growth in firms that are below 2 or 3 and below, is actually extremely low. These are not, so we should be very careful when people talk about, small and medium-sized enterprises. At the lower end, there's not much happening. 20 is already a pretty good firm, actually, in many of the countries I work in. That's bad. Of course, very few people in these very poor countries work in multinational firms.
Yes.
And I would actually say it would probably be not a bad idea that we have a few more multinationals employing lots of people, because large firms, maybe unfortunately for some of the prejudices that some of you may have, but large firms are the ones that tend to deliver high labor productivity and therefore higher wages for people. So there is something there. Maybe allow me to actually try to see whether I can convince you. Just as things like PISA and so on, international standards help to benchmark what's happening in particular countries. Sometimes bringing in foreign direct investment helps to benchmark the possibilities of production frontiers and so on. Actually, they're a pretty good way of technology transfer and getting things going in economies. So I wouldn't mind seeing it a bit more in quite a lot of countries. And I do think it would be pretty good for the poor and for employment and for lots of things.
I've just been getting a text from Professor Se-young from South Korea, who's actually in the Netherlands today, so if that's not confusing. Can we try to bring Se-young onto the call? Because there's probably not a better example of a country that's transformed itself in the last 50, 60 years with certainly a heavy degree of education change. Se-young, are you online?
Okay, I'm on. Do you hear me?
Okay, we can't see you on the screen yet, but I'm sure we can hear you well. So please make your point, Se-young.
Okay, very good morning, and I'm very pleased to say something. It is very clear and without any objection. Education and development is very late. We are saying that. But I should share my idea that we have not sufficiently consider the difficulties of education itself. We may think education is something easy job, but it is a very difficult job, I think. We should think why we have been postponing of education goal in the developing countries specifically for the decades and decades and decades. And I think this is something we have done in wrong way without some sufficient consideration in literacy and how the children have difficulties to learn something when they go up to grade and grade up to secondary school and the university even. So I would suggest we should keep more consideration on the difficulties of learning when they are very 3 or 4 or 5 when they learn how to read and write. That is the starting point. But we are just thinking about those students who are doing already well, not at all.
Here.
So from my country's history, I'm thinking why we have succeeded in educational development. I think that is because in the 1950s, just after the liberation and war, we succeeded to get every children literate, at least in reading and writing in our mother tongue. So that is a starting point. So I suggest that we should keep clear and fundamental consideration about the difficulties of learning. This is very important for developed countries as well in this digital technology world. So the children now getting the difficulties to learn another level of literacy in computing. This is my suggestion. Thank you for your hearing.
Thank you, Seyang. I'm sorry that your video camera stopped working before we got to you.
Eduardo did a very good job.
But Eduardo on screen did a very good job without realizing it. In a moment, I'm going to go across to Paris and speak to Riel Miller at UNESCO because I think there's some very interesting things there about new literacies, building on traditional literacies and moving into new literacies, that Seyang said. But I'd first like to go across to Dawn Halliburn, who's been looking at the Twitter feed. If we can pick up Dawn at the front, please, guys. Dawn, is anybody asking questions, first of all? And or if not, anything catching your eye that people are saying?
There are. We've had questions in from America and Warsaw and Dublin and Norway. One that's come in from Poland from at Studio Mentals is asking, with what you're saying about creating jobs, are education systems able to do this instead of responding to the market trends? And if education is reproducing the inequalities because it's pursuing the economy instead of shaping it?
And where did those questions come from, Dawn?
Warsaw.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are you noticing any trends yourself?
No, it's mainly is education reproducing these inequalities that we're talking today.
Andreas or Stefan, would you like to comment on?
Well, I think one part of this question is very clear. Unfortunately, in many, even the richest countries in the world, we can say that education tends to reinforce inequality in the sense of reinforcing the impact of social background. But there are some great examples of this too. I think if you look to Northern Europe, you can see really how education mediates this. If you look to East Asia, again, you go to the poorest provinces in China, and you can see people getting a decent education. I mean, Shanghai is a wealthy province in China, but the 10% of the most disadvantaged children in Shanghai, who are really living in very, very tough conditions, outperform the wealthiest kids in many European and North American cities. And that tells us that actually education does have the potential to actually foster inclusion and create sort of prospects for people. I think that's a clear part. On the question, do we educate people with the right skills to create new jobs? One thing that we have to realize that education today, good education today, is not about getting people to reproduce what they have learned. No. The knowledge economy no longer rewards you just for what you know. Google knows everything. The knowledge economy rewards you for what you can do with what you know. That's the differentiator today. It's about ways of thinking, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. It's about ways of working, collaboration, teamwork, managing, resolving conflicts. Those are the kind of skills. It's about tools for working. The digital literacy is today what reading and writing was in the 19th century. And I think those things are at the premium. If you master those kinds of skills, all our data suggests you have a great life.
Stefan?
Yeah, just to add, the link between education and inequality, and also the ability of education to really overcome inequality via mobility, it is a force there. It's not easy, obviously. It's not easy. But let me at least say the basic truth that we do have, that in terms of an absolute improvement of the bottom end of the income distribution, education has been extremely powerful. If it's in terms of fighting absolute poverty, education has been a really powerful correlate. And it's actually quite interesting because it is, I say, a correlate because the causation goes in two ways. One of the striking things is that, people that are educated even in the poorest countries, and if poverty starts going down, they are the ones that often can capture these benefits from the progress. At the same time, it's often the first thing what parents do to start investing in. And if they have some money, so they value it, and it's a kind of a virtuous cycle. But, I'm cautious. I know it's a powerful way of fighting inequalities. How successful it is, as Andreas is suggesting, it's extremely hard to do this. On the educating for jobs and so on and a good education, if I transfer it again back to kind of very poor settings, if education is done well, then in these poor settings, it is still about extremely basic skills, getting the basic numeracy, getting the basic reading skills, reasoning skills going, but it is also about more. One of the strong correlates with children that are educated, even in the poorest context, is that it correlates very well with some basic psychosocial indicators like internal locus of control, efficacy. Can I actually control? Do I believe that I can make a difference myself and things like that? And that's very powerful for giving people opportunities to actually do better in the world. And we should not underestimate it and not just focus only on the basic skills. And I do think, again, it's something we can do quite a lot better on, even in the poorest settings, to get these kind of more non-cognitive aspects, as we often refer to them, maybe erroneously, but to actually make sure they feature in education as well.
Thank you, Stefan. I'd like to go across the UNESCO in Paris, if we can, to Riel Miller, who's been talking about this shift between knowledge and what I think, Riel, you call the learning society in this century, or the learning century. Can we go across to Paris? Hopefully we'll get a different picture to Eduardo this time.
You're looking good, Eduardo.
No Paris? Okay, well, while we're trying to sort Paris out, I wonder if we can turn Claudia Costin from the World Bank, sitting in the front row. I couldn't miss you with your lovely red jacket, so I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on you now. Would you like to actually add anything to what's been said so far?
Okay, it is intimidating, you're right. Okay, while I was listening to, especially to Andreas Schleicher, I was wondering about the situation of the out-of-school children, especially the kids that drop out of school. So, two related questions. First, how do we deal with this dropouts, those out-of-school children, to ensure some skills for them to survive in the 21st century? And the other question is how to prepare teachers to avoid kids dropping out of schools. I come prior to the World Bank from I was Secretary of Education in Rio de Janeiro, where we have some complicated slums, to say the least, where dropping out was an issue, and unfortunately is still an issue.
So Andreas, would you like to answer? And then I'm standing up because I'd like to bring people from the audience in. And being an ex-teacher, I might pick on somebody if nobody puts their hand up. So get ready. So Andreas, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think this is an absolutely crucial agenda. And part of the problem is that those children are totally off our radar screen. Now, public policy essentially deals with those who are somehow inscribed in a formal education institution. There's very little happening for those out of school. I must say we were guilty of this well in our international assessments. We test children in school and we know nothing about those out of school. It's changing now. Actually, last Friday I was in Dakar working with Senegal. We're actually going to go out in the country to test those kids, the kind of knowledge and skills they have who are out of school. What can we do about it? I mean, first of all, is provide much more flexible ways of learning. Again, workplace learning. Getting people, getting employers engaged in this, providing learning opportunities. There's a lot happening. But also in the formal education sector. In fact, this is not just an issue for poor countries. Some of the richest countries in the world have large young people, groups of young people who are no longer in school. It's not about resources, it's about engagement. You know, these young people do not feel that schools offers them something that is worth going to. This is part of the problem. I think Stefan raised the issue of, social and emotional skills. They are a big part of the equation. If we are not able to sort of engage those young people in learning, showing them that what they get in school is opening up their life opportunities, they may sit through to get an exam if they come from a privileged background. But they're not going to put up with this if they do not see how what they do there is opening their life opportunities and giving teachers a sense that they are not there to sort of just drill for an exam, but prepare young people for life, to sort of build this link between what schools do and what the societies are like. I think we are not going to see that gap closing. No.
Stefan?
Just very quickly, if we take a kind of a cost-effectiveness approach to this as well, and what are we doing here? Sometimes if you listen to the nutritionist, it's all over by the age of 1 or 2. Fortunately, research is showing that many people working in education have always known is that it's not all over. It can still be done. And I think there's a similar approach to thinking about, it may well be most cost effective to try to get the children really, really young, but even if we don't get them then, there's still things to be done. But I think it is then still the case that trying to keep them in school and trying to offer something that's useful is probably always going to be more cost effective than trying to deal with it later. But even so, if we couldn't manage with them, dealing with them later is still going to be better than waiting until they're in their 20s, in their 30s, and so on. And so there is a kind of approach, try to grab them first, but don't give up on them, that I think would be the most cost-effective way of dealing with it.
Immediately makes me wonder why the MDG originally only went to primary. But that's another story. David Coulthard, former Minister of Education in Zimbabwe. Did you try to catch my eye there, David? You did want to speak. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I was intrigued by your comments, and I think that Zimbabwe is a very interesting example of what you were saying, because Zimbabwe has one of the best education systems in Africa, very high literacy rates, and yet it has not benefited Zimbabwe's economy very greatly. It has benefited South Africa's economy, Botswana's economy, even Britain's economy, because we've generated a high number of academically qualified children. There's a great desire in Zimbabwe to change the system. But I want to come to the issue of cost. The cost of transforming an education system which is primarily academically orientated into one which has more of a vocational balance. And there are three issues that prohibit that transition. The first is to attract the right quality of teachers who can teach those vocational skills. Andreas, you were talking about digital literacy. So many of our teachers do not themselves have those education, that knowledge. Tied to the first one is the cost of training teachers in those practical skills. And then thirdly is the cost of developing educational institutions, schools in particular, that have the equipment, the facilities to teach practical subjects. And the reality is that even where you have the will in a third world country to achieve that balance, the cost of teaching academic subjects is much cheaper than teaching practical skills. And so what we need, in essence, are two things, in my view. We need, as regards the individual countries, an even greater commitment to investing in education. But now to speak to, in the context of DFID, we need a much greater investment internationally into developing those practical schools and developing the teachers who can teach those practical subjects. Thank you.
Just take one more comment. There are 5 rows from the back on the aisle there. The chap, if you just raise your hand, please. That's it, in front of you there.
Thank you so much. I'm Malik. I work for Government of Pakistan, and a very loud and clear message this morning is that education is the best and the first thing to do in life. But one of the colleagues from the World Bank has just stated that the real issue in the developing countries is the number of out-of-school children. And the challenge is how to ensure equitable and affordable quality education. And to meet these challenges, what is required is the institutional development and, of course, low-cost private schools, which Professor has just mentioned. And these have been very successful models. So the best models that the good models that we have seen, how those to be replicated in developing countries is, again, a maverick challenge, because it's the question of financing once it comes to educating millions of children who are out of school. So for that, probably the organizations, the national governments, the political economy, and the world around has to work together.
So it's an interesting mix here of the number of children not in school. When they go to school, we want them to be taught in different ways, but the gap between teachers' actual skills in the classroom to be able to, let me talk in real practical terms of being a teacher. If I bring in a class and sit you down and talk to you, that's a skill. If I need you to work in groups, that's a different skill. And so we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of teachers just knowing how to actually implement even group activities, David, in academic subjects, not necessarily in the vocational either. So one more comment from Vera Costa from Brazil, and then we're going to try to get Riel back online and then come back to you, Andreas.
I think that building on what has been said here about inclusion, about your comment on how to change education, we also have to build on research, especially economic research on development, because we are using old-fashioned models. We are looking to the world behind. And actually, this has not been helpful for the developing countries to make decisions. Actually, talking about public policy, there is a problem. Like in my country, we have a new government now, and we have to go under a fiscal adjustment. The first cut is on education, and this is what happens everywhere. So actually, this link between development and education is not clear to our reality nowadays, and how developing countries can go on without big companies that really increase productivity.
Thank you. So we're just going to try to go to Riel. Can we bring Riel in, guys, from Paris? Maybe not. We had a problem with picking up his voice before. But Eduardo, you still look very good in Sao Paulo. Thank you. Andreas.
Yeah, I want to take up the issue that David raised. I think it's a very, very relevant question. Getting teachers to develop vocational skills or provide career guidance isn't only difficult in Zimbabwe. It's a big challenge anywhere. Teachers are not in the best position to teach those skills that they haven't acquired themselves. Teaching about the world of work, the world of learning, and things like this. So it's a real challenge. Vocational education in most countries doesn't work well if it is just provided in academic institutions. This is about bringing the work-based learning into the field, getting employers involved, getting people from employment into schools, to create really schools that become everybody's business. This is where vocational education really functions, and where you can get actually teachers becoming productive part of that equation. I think this is the challenge that we still have in mind, is we focus on the kind of education that is cheap to provide in standardized form, academic education, teaching people to read and write. But when it comes to those kinds of applied skills, vocational skills, we need other forms of learning. And I think that's really the answer I have to this. On the cost structure, teacher training. I think if you start with the assumption, well, you know, we first have to get those teachers trained, and then we have to wait until they are in the schools, and then we're going to change what's happening in schools, you're putting your bets 20, 30 years out, because basically through initial teacher training, you reach 2% of the teaching force. No? The renewal of teaching isn't very, very fast. The only answer really is to get that into the schools, to basically build this kind of teacher development into school systems, to develop a much higher degree of professional autonomy, but in a collaborative culture. And if you look at some of the most rapidly improving education systems, Brazil in South America, China in Asia, what do? They're not sort of thinking about, well, I have to develop a new pipeline for new teachers, but they use the teachers they have today, get the best teachers actually to become model teachers, give them a role in the education systems, to have a high degree of professional autonomy in a collaborative culture. And I think this is often an underexploited resource. In education, we have this idea, it's all an issue of the ministry, of teacher training institutions, rather than thinking, who are the teachers today that do a great job? How can we use them actually to help other teachers grow in their professional careers? It's about career differentiation, career diversity. It's all those kinds of things.
Yes, and let me quickly make two comments. Actually, one is on vocational training, and I just want to reinforce this comment that I think we've seen in research and also just talking to a lot of different places where vocational training is being done. In systems, you know, government systems where vocational training has been offered, it often is not very, very good. And just, you know, teachers may never have actually done these jobs themselves. They've not been active. One of the most exciting examples of what seemed to be a successful vocational training scheme I saw in Nepal, where actually these were private providers of vocational training. But the way it was, this was all in construction skills and related skills. And where did they take it? These were people that had returned from Dubai, from construction sites. They came back, set up businesses. They knew what was required even by the global market. These little firms are incredibly successful getting both vocational skills for the local market and indeed for the international market. And it's very striking. But a key thing which I would actually recommend anyone providing vocational training, a little payment by results framework wouldn't do any harm. You can get paid for your vocational training if you can actually get this person, if the person gets a job. And then actually the incentives get a bit better aligned. And there's too much going on here that a lot of skills are being trained in vocational training, but actually without any understanding of the labor market. And then it's, again, disappointment for people. People pay a lot of money and so on. And then another point on the colleague from Pakistan, which I very much appreciated the comments he made. And I think there is an issue with educational systems. You know, we tend to typically mimic the past, hang on to what we have. We also try to mimic others. Learning from others is not mimicking others. Educational systems are embedded in local systems, in local political economy, local governances, and so on. And understanding what is best for a particular context requires to understand. It goes about, and in fact research has been very weak on it, picking up little bits and pieces, presenting as if, you know, an evidence on a textbook in India can be translated everywhere in the world. It is all bitty. Systems work, and I would say maybe do a bit of advertising here for the work we're doing at DFID, but trying to reinvigorate research by always focusing on systems and to try to make sure we look at the systems, including on the governance, political economy, making this much more evidence-based, making this much more context-specific. And in that sense, the example of the private schooling in Pakistan and India, that's actually what's really interesting, because it is surprising, the outcome. You know, most of us would have thought private schooling is not going to deliver for poor people, but we get suddenly examples of new things that we didn't expect. I'm not saying we should mimic them everywhere, but we should try to understand and try to make sure we keep in our own context learning from innovations where we can actually get a little bit of vigor in the system via various ways.
And you know, this is one of the underlying aims of Education Fast Forward, is for people to pass on ideas that actually, well, not ideas, things that actually work. Because there seems to be a problem right through the education system on the planet that, well, in fact, it's within a school, isn't it? A teacher in one classroom can be the best teacher in the world. In the classroom next door, they don't even know that that practice is happening. So within and without schools. So some of these vocational things have been tackled over the years in the UK, and we've got Bob here who advises Toshiba. And Bob, you've got ambassadors who go into schools doing things around vocational education, I think. Would you like to make a comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, can I just make a point about what Andreas said, because I couldn't agree with him more when he talked about trying to shoehorn vocational education into an academic system that's predicated on academic performance is just not going to work. Now, we have got some experience here. Toshiba is one of the lead sponsors in a couple of university technical colleges where the employers are getting much closer to the provision. But I think most of us who are involved in English education here, you know, really worry about the demise of the careers education service and the system. Because, as you rightly say, teachers who've gone straight from school to college and university and then back into teaching have very little experience of the world of work. And one of the things about the Toshiba ambassadors that we try and do is to bring a much closer relationship and synergy between what the teachers are doing and what's happening in the workplace. I think there's just one other point, Jim, I'd like to pick up on from the Twitter feed from Kathy Rubin. I think we're all getting to the point of agreeing that universal access to broadband is becoming a human right. And giving people access, it's not the only question, but surely it cannot be fair, it cannot be right that some children, particularly I noticed a BBC story today, that private schools in this country are now giving their pupils online textbooks for free, and yet we'll have pupils elsewhere who just don't have the connectivity. That just cannot be right.
Thanks. The gentleman with the red tie wanted to comment a little while ago. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Professor Jacob Kaimeni. I'm the Minister for Education, Science and Technology in Kenya. Allow me just to make one or two comments. I do agree that there's a case for us to educate people to develop jobs, create jobs, and indeed wealth. And to me, there's a need for us to encourage people to change their attitudes so that white-collar mentality, we can do away with it, if we can. The issue of the poor. In Kenya, we have a wonderful program where we talk about Wings to Fly, which is a program by one of the local banks. And here we empower children from the poor, children who are marginalized. And I want to give you an example. Over the last 3 years, through that program, we have managed to transit those children from the poor backgrounds, 97%, to attain university education. And indeed, the best universities in the world. There's a discussion we have, the narrative that we have. Eventually, we must involve the teachers for the purposes of ownership. Therefore, I agree we need to have a bottom-up approach. Because once in a while, the teachers feel left out from this gravity train. Finally, there was this recommendation about use of budgets of education better. I want to agree, that is true. But then we must ask ourselves, what is the role of parents, of students, and pupils in this matter? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in the front, on the far side over there, we're going to test your abilities with your pole vaulting pole. Thank you.
My name is Abdulrahman Mutairi. I'm from Saudi Arabia. We are running a massive transformation for our vocational education system. And what we realized that two parts of the equation, the demand and supply. For the demand, the main obstacle that getting real data about how the labor market is moving, and we have a couple of solutions in that zone. From supply side, what we are working, we find it's not only the teacher that we need to develop, but we need to develop the teachers, covering the gap, industrial experience they have, the learning environment, the equipment, all together on the same time. And the challenge that we have that change resistance is high from teachers all the time. And more of clarity, more of matching the teachers with the real problems and giving them the data about the real situation of the graduates and how many people we need to go to the market, quite get them in alignment of the execution of this project. And we did this, and we think this is the only right way to do it, is with the full partnership with the private sector. So we get provider from over all the world coming and partner with the Saudi government to do the education for our graduates. And I think this is an interesting exercise that we do. Inshallah, we will give more detail in the conference about this.
Thank you. Okay. Well, time's against us. There's another meeting in here at 11, so we're moving to closing remarks. Andreas, have you a few minutes of closing remarks?
Yeah, actually, I think both questions raise a lot of interesting and very important issues. I mean, first of all, teachers, leaving teachers out of the equation. And that is, I think, comes out in both dimensions. You know, if teachers are not part of the reform, and not just in the implementation of reform, but in the design of reforms, you know, in the conceptualization of reform, if they are not the drivers of change, they're going to resist change. We are all done like that, by the way. I think that's sort of one of the things that we're going to see everywhere. So the question is, how can we, for example, if we think about anticipation of skill needs, it's actually a very, very hard thing. Who knows what skills are going to be required tomorrow? We can sort of see some emerging broad trends, you know, move towards more transversal skills, cross-disciplinary knowledge, all of those kind of things. But specifically, very, very hard to predict the future. No. Trends are always the future of the past. No. But to think about the future is actually very, very difficult. What is the answer to this? Is to give people a sense of how the world is changing. If we can get give our teachers more opportunities to see how the world of work looks like, no? Not just internships for students, but actually getting teachers on board of this. Some vocational education and training systems are great in this, in that, you know, they give the people at the workplace pedagogical experience so that they become good teachers, and they give people in the school the skills to relate to the world of work. And then, you know, you suddenly see that teachers become the friends of change, the supporters of change. The other point I want to make is, and that's, I think, a crucial point as well, how do you can get parents on board? How do you get society on board to support education? That's the only way how you can make this a sustainable business of this. And again, you know, if we keep education systems as sort of an inward-looking closed shop, it's going to be very, very hard to do this. If we can't sort of create an open school, a school that is actually looking towards society, I think it's going to be very difficult to get parents on board. And again, you know, I was in one of the poorest provinces in China, and what impressed me is that you had every teacher calling every parent twice a week. You know, it's not the school waiting for the parents to come. It's the school going out to the parents to see actually what is your problem. Why is your child not in school? How can you better support your child in your development? And I think strengthening those connections, absolutely crucial. Making education everybody's business is the only answer. And I think if you look in the context in the Middle East, you know, it's very, very tough. You know, I once wrote an article, you know, education, oil and pizza doesn't mix. It's very hard in an economy that extracts its wealth from natural resources to get people to think that the future is in their mind, in their heads, in their own creativity. And I think you face a double challenge, getting society on board to actually see the future rather than the current. But again, you know, if you don't get society aligned, if you don't get parents in support of this, just working on the supply side isn't going to be the sole answer.
It's, you know, I've seen this working very well in Mukuru, just in Nairobi, where people went into the neighborhoods. If a child was away, they'd feed the whole family before the child would come back, and it worked very well. I missed out Gerald, who's a primary school head teacher from Hippo Valley in Zimbabwe. He's come all the way, and I forgot to bring you in earlier. So before we go to Stefan, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I've been making my notes as we're going along. Are there any other head teachers here?
There's one head teacher to another. You've got 2 minutes, right? Because I know we can talk for 20.
Andreas just raised a very valid point. The community engagement involvement of parents.
Yeah.
We have an exam-based, academic-based system where we text 12-year-olds, and that's the most important thing to our parent body. We do have, our private school system has a computer exam, which they don't actually pay any attention to. We've got to engage the community and our parents more, and their expectations need to be also made more realistic.
Thank you. Thank you. Stefan.
My closing comment is just rather simple. I think we all agree we need to make sure that the children that we educate, you know, they should have basic skills, but they need more. We want them to be self-critical, creative, you know, have a more focus on evidence, less prejudice, and so on. Okay. But I think also all of us involved in policy making around education, we should actually do quite a lot better if we're a bit more self-critical and understand that we actually can do quite a lot better and don't blame all the others for all the problems in the systems. There's a lot of things we can do. Maybe we can't create all the jobs for all the children that come out, but we can do quite a lot of things within the education systems to make them much more effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I hand over to Gavin for the concluding remarks, and by the way, it's a miracle. I don't know why, Gavin, you haven't spoken before now. What's wrong?
You didn't let me.
I didn't let you, okay. That we will follow up with a webinar. If you want to reflect on some of the things that have been said, we'll announce a webinar through EFF12.org, so people can come back after a period of time and Then the video of this debate will be online, and also a synopsis of the video. And we don't just want this to be a one-off event. We want it to continue. So with that, Gavin, can you possibly summarise that last hour and a half?
I'll leave others to judge whether I have or not. But I'll pick up a few of the comments that have come through to me along the way. I mean, clearly the link between education and employment or entrepreneurship or whatever link there is, and the development of economies as a result is not a simple equation. If it was, I think someone would have solved it perhaps a long time ago. And there are a number of things like we change what we measure comes through. So what we choose to measure is a really important thing to bring out. The systems and people adjust. So whatever we might change by a policy, we don't always get the consequences that we expect. And so we have to think very carefully about how we play those games, as it were. The balance of skills of knowledge-based and vocational education, I think it was really important to bring out the difference between vocational education and developmental skills. There's been a lot about the importance of intellectual humility, of taking responsibility, of emergent leadership, and those kinds of things. I know we didn't discuss each of those, but those are the kinds of things that are coming through to me as the soft skills that are important in any kind of success, whether you're working with your knowledge-based education or whether you're working with your skills. The part that comes through about bottom-up and top-down, I think, is really important. We have figures for all the teachers in the world and the part that they play in taking things forward. We also have all the students in the world. And actually, the part that they can play in, as we seek to develop and respond to their aspirations is something that's really, has a really, I think, great contribution to make. And I always think of the children being at the sharp end of innovation and development, where an awful lot of the ideas come through. And there's an army of those that I'm afraid frequently are not heard. There was the issue about self-employment and employment and actually getting the balance of that right. And I think that's really important, that it's easy to see the conclusion that or the way we're wanting to travel, which is to develop greater understanding of entrepreneurship and enterprise. But I think that's possibly because the balance has been in the other direction for a long time. So I see it, this is not a false dichotomy of one thing or the other. It's just finding the right balance for your country at a particular time, or for your circumstance at a particular time. There's, I think, something really important and something that comes through, and I hope Education Fast Forward makes us at least a small contribution to that, is that alignment of education with opportunity. If we're not speaking to each other, if we're not breaking the walls down of schools so that the schools are speaking with the community and the community speaking with the school, then I think we get greater challenges and we're less likely to see something that is well aligned. And of course, schools are only one part of it. Because, as we know, many children, and as is coming out in a report being launched today, the out-of-school children are not part of it if we only look to schools. So I'm delighted to hear of things that are happening to reach beyond schools and to reach those children who are actually losing out in all cases at the moment. I love the idea of schools as havens of openness, and schools where people are going to be drawn to rather than feeling they have to go, with attracting teachers with the right qualities and thinking carefully about what those qualities are in a changing world, of developing teacher training and their development so that they fit that new world, and developing the places of learning, which I'm calling it that rather than schools, because I think NGOs and other people make an extraordinary contribution in different ways. And we need to work in collaborative ways with all those parties in order that we provide the greatest opportunities for our children. So just coming to the end of this, I think the statement that really summarizes a lot of this for me is that we should remember that the knowledge economy rewards you for what you do with what you know. And I think it reminds me of innovation. Innovation is an idea plus its implementation. It's not good enough just to have the idea. It's what you do with what you know, and we should be aligning our education around that.
Thanks, Gavin. Thank you very much. Well, that time has flown over. I don't know where it's gone. It doesn't happen without a lot of people making things, from the boom operator to actually bringing in 6 places outside of this room into a room like this is extremely complicated. So thank you to Polycom and Yorktel for making that happen, and to Mary Lenahan's team who've been working right behind the scenes. We are missing a person today, Greg Butler, who left us yesterday, tragically. His passion was collaboration. He really saw a future where if you collaborate together, things would just get better. So as a legacy to Greg, I think let's collaborate after this meeting. If you've got practical examples that can make that needle move on that dial around this, then please tell anybody and everybody, but please come through EFF if you can. So with thanks to Stefan and Andreas, thank you for coming this morning. I hope you got to say what you did when you wanted to, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for coming along.